Shalom, Kahala Yahweh, Bashem Yahshai, Bashem Rakakwadash. Double honors my teachers, the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Peace and mercy to the elect, where the house of David be born again in this generation. And Shalom to the 130 Yasharallah, who today are known as the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who before losing our true heritage, we were known as and still are the true Hebrew Israelites of the Holy Bible. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the captivity of Israel under the Ishmaelites and the Hamites, but primarily of the Ishmaelites, and touching upon the subject of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Right? In fact, the reason I'm going to make this lesson is because I was watching I like to watch strategy videos, and this channel that I watch, he actually goes into historic events and kind of explains what happens, kind of like a documentary. Well, he happened to cover the sub-Saharan slave trade, right? Basically, when the Southern Kingdom of Israel, right, your modern day so-called American Negroes, West Indians, and also the Haitians, right? When they were refugees in the land of Africa, the true Africans, right, the Hamites and the Arabs were complicit in sending the Southern Kingdom into slavery under all over the world, the known world at that time, right? Basically into China, India, and ultimately into the hands of Edom, which would bring them here to the Americas, right? But let's go ahead and focus on this quick biblical recap that I'm going to do right before I show you this video. The video is 60 minutes, and I'm going to stop the lesson at the end of the video, and I'm just going to go ahead and get all of the biblical precepts now and just give you details about it. But before we get into that, let's read this scripture. This is Jeremiah 17:4. And thou, even thyself, shalt discontinue from thine heritage that I gave thee, and I will cause thee to serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not. For ye have kindled a fire in mine anger, which shall burn forever. Now this right here is talking about how the Lord ultimately put down a curse upon us Israelites, the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. Well, let's go ahead and go to the Bible timeline to basically get how this played out. Okay. Now, when you go back to, all the way to when the Southern Kingdom was kicked out of the land, which is described as 2 Kings 17:23, this took place around 722 BC, where the Northern Kingdom, which would be your modern day Latino and Native American Indians, right? When we were known as the Northern Kingdom of Israel, or the Kingdom of Israel, okay? The Lord cast us out of Israel and took us into slavery, which again, you can read about it in the book of 2nd Ezra 13 and 40, right? Basically talks about how the Northern Kingdom, the Latinos, Native Americans, made their way over here to the Americas after about 100 years of slavery under the Assyrians, okay? And during this time, you get books like the book of Tobit, by the way, and you also get the book of Judith and other, here you go. Right, Judith took place right before the Northern Kingdom went into slavery, right? But it's around that same period. Now, eventually, the Southern Kingdom, which would be the kingdom of the so-called Negroes, right? Because again, remember, the Negro is the true biblical Jews. Well, around a little after the Northern Kingdom, when we came over here to the Americas, about 100 years, 597 BC, right? Again, this is about 600 years before the Messiah came onto the scene, right before Yahweh Shai was born. Well, the Southern Kingdom gets sent into captivity under the Babylonians, but this was only for a short time until they returned from being led by Ezra and Zerubbabel back into Israel. Well, eventually what happened is you got to go all the way through history, from when the Edomites came into power, as the Greeks, right? They started taking over. They themselves even took over spaces of Ishmael as the Nabateans. The Mayan Empire was born, and so forth and so forth. But you get all the way to 70 AD. And let's go ahead, and we're almost there, right? You got basically Yahweh Shai is born, okay? Then that's when John the Baptist starts his ministry. Yahweh Shai starts his ministry. St. John's head is then taken, right? You got the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and so forth. Well, eventually what happened is this is what happened. 70 AD, which was prophesied by, when you read Luke 21, by the Messiah, talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? And who by? Well, the Romans, who would be your modern day Caucasian race today. Okay, they destroyed Jerusalem. You could read the books of like a modern book, which would be Babylon to Timbuktu, right? This, I believe, came out in the 80s, 70s or 80s. Well, it tells you, man, that how the Jews, that fled the 70 AD destruction, fled into Africa, right? And there's other places that the Jews fled to, right? But again, primarily they went into Africa. We'll get to that later on. And then you can also read about the destruction of Jerusalem by the works of Flavius Josephus, right? He was a Levitical priest and basically the man that was running Jerusalem at the time when it fell, okay? But eventually, the southern kingdom fled into Africa, and there they would become refugees for, I think, 1,500 years, right? That's 1,500 years, until they started to be hunted and sold into the slave trade, right? And who by? Well, the same people who have influenced the southern kingdom today, right? Right here, you're seeing a bunch of Israelites practicing a religion known as Islam, which again belongs to the Ishmaelites or the Arabs, okay? See, the so-called Negroes should not be practicing Islam. And why is that? Well, because all religions are not to be observed, right? The thing is about them is that they basically get in between you and the Lord. All you have to do is basically read the Bible and come back to your true heritage, right? Not practice some man-made doctrine, right? Simply follow the laws that you were given in your heritage, right? Because again, when you read the Bible, read Deuteronomy 28, these are the blessings that we would get. And from Deuteronomy 28:15 on down, those are the curses that would befall us if we did not follow the Lord, which we did not, and that's why we are currently in our state that we're in, right? When you read those curses, that only applies to us. Now, like I said, you got a lot of Southern Kingdom brothers who are lost in this religion, right? And not only this religion, but also, they refer to themselves as Black Muslims or Black Islamists. But again, this is all misdirection in the search for their roots, because again, their roots go back to the Bible. Now, you also got other Southern Kingdom brothers who believe that they're Moors, right? They believe that the ultimate truth is Moorism, and what's basically taught by Drew Ali and the Black Moor Society and all that stuff. But again, they don't realize that Islam and also Moors is a result of being under the captivity or slavery of Ishmael. Okay, just like you have so-called Negro men who are Christians, right? That is a result of them being under the captivity of the Edomites, right? The Caucasians. So all these images you're seeing here of these Israelites who are basically living as Arabs, they have taken on the Arabs' religion, which is Islam, and that's where you get Moors, and that's why you have a strong ties to Muslim within the Southern Kingdom brothers, community. Okay. This is the ultimate biblical reason of why that is, right? Deuteronomy 28:48. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which Yahweh B'Shem Yahshai shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in what all want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he has destroyed thee. Right? And like I said again, it all started in 70 AD, right? The final, the big captivity of the southern kingdom, which eventually would lead to their falling away, right? It started, like I said, the destruction of the temple, Jerusalem. Here's a famous photo showing the Israelites trying to flee. Oh, I'm sorry, the Romans basically besieging the city, right? And here you have that famous photo of the sacking of the temple, right? This right here is basically the horned altar. There you can see the menorah being taken out, and this is all being done by Rome. The Romans, who would be again your Edomites at that time. Here's another etching of the events, and if you actually look, if you go to Rome, there are monuments made up of the destruction, right? This is right here is known as the Arch of Titus. And when you zoom in, you can actually see the commemoration of the destruction and also the taking of the menorah. And here's the image right here. Then there's actually, here, let me see, right? There's better images that I have right here, right? You can basically see how they're showing a group of people carrying the menorah in. And check this out. When I went to Rome in 2008, before I came into the truth, I actually went to Rome, right? And I went to the museum right there in the Colosseum, and they had this coin, and I had no idea about this coin at the time, right? This is about 4 years before I came into the truth. Now, what happened is I was just taking photos of everything, and I was going through it because I knew I was doing this lesson, and I found this coin, right? And now I know what this coin is, right? Because the apostles have brought it out, right? But here it was, in my night, in my fallen away state, in my Gentile state, I took this photo unknowing that this happened to my people, right? This was talking about my ancient downfall, right? And what it is, it's a coin that was minted, which basically says Judah's Capta, right? J-U-D, right? And then I can't really, basically, it's an A at the end, Judea, right? So basically Judea Capta, right? And right here you see a Roman, basically over an Israelite, right? A Southern Kingdom brother, right? And check that out, man. I actually took this photo, right? That's a trip. Well, ultimately, this historic event has been highlighted in an awesome book known as Babylon, From Babylon to Timbuktu, which basically explains how the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and brought them over here to Africa, which eventually brought them over here to Babylon the Great, America. Well, let's just read this part real quick from this book. It says, in the year 65 BC, the Roman armies under General Pompey captured Jerusalem. In 70 AD, right, so a little bit over 100 years of Jerusalem being under captivity and all that stuff, General Vespasian and his son Titus put an end to the Jewish state. Right here it should say Judean, right? But because again, Jewish are the false Jews, right? And with great slaughter. During the period of the military governors of Palestine, many outrages and atrocities were committed against the residue of the people. During the period from Pompey to Julius, it has been estimated that over 1 million Jews fled into Africa, fleeing from Roman persecution and slavery. Right? So those who stayed in Jerusalem became slaves. Right? And this is where you see those slaves would eventually go on in Rome, the ones that were kept there, and they would then have generations there. And this is where you see Jake, right, or the southern kingdom of Judah take over Rome around the 200 or 400 periods. Okay, this is where you have Septimius Severus, Constantine the Great, right? This is when the Vatican was created and so forth. Well, the estimated 1 million Jews, though, the so-called Negroes, they fled into Africa primarily, right? They went all over the place, man. To up here to where Carthage was at, to the west coast, east coast, where basically Judah, Benjamin, and Levi all basically were spread throughout Africa, right? And also you had a lot of northern kingdom people amongst them, right? A lot of people from Zebulun. When you read the Bible, you hear about how the other tribes, people from the other tribes were also amongst Judah. Because again, after the northern kingdom, the Latinos, Native Americans were freed from Assyria, or the Assyrians. Some of them just went back home and basically went back to Jerusalem, or they stayed in Persia, or wherever they were at. Well, once they basically became refugees in Africa, they stayed there for 1,000 years. This is Deuteronomy 28 and 64. And Yahweh Bashem Yahushai shall scatter thee amongst all people from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods. Notice it's gods with a small g, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Right? Ultimately, this would become Christianity, the cross, the wooden cross, and basically Islam, the stone worshiping, right? What is it? The Kaaba stone, which represents the Queen of Heaven, Ishtar, or Diana, right? Semiramis. It's trippy, man. Let's read this. This is Deuteronomy 28 and 65. And amongst these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but Yahweh Hashem Ashai shall give thee there a trembling heart, and a failing of eyes, and sorrow for mind, and your life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and thou shalt have none assurance of thy life. Right? And basically, this is ultimately talking about all the captivities that we would eventually go into, and in this case, the Saharan slave trade, Slaki, right? And again, you can pause this and you kind of read about it. But again, we're going to be watching a quick documentary at the end of this that's going to get into what happened to the Southern Kingdom when they fled into Africa, right? How Ishmael, right, which is, I guess you could call them our biblical, uncles, right? Because again, Ishmael is the uncle of Jacob, who we come out of, right? And again, the Hamites are the children of Cain, right? This is Joel 3 and 4. Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon? Right? Tyre is the Hamites, right? And Zidon would be like the Arabs, okay? And all the coast of Palestine, right? Because again, right there in Palestine, which is basically over there in the land of Israel, that's where you had a lot of Ishmaelites, okay? And also Hamites, right? Because again, this is where the Canaanites were all originally destroyed, okay? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me swiftly and speedily, will I return your recompense upon your head. Right? Remember when Africa apologized to the American Negroes for selling them into slavery? Because they understand that the American Negro, which they call akata, right, which is like cotton, or for cotton pickers, they understand that they are not the same people. Okay, they understand that the American Negro are in fact some of them don't know that they're the Israelites. They just know that they're different. But again, the wise Hamites over there, they understand who the American Negro is, right? They would be the true Jews, the Israelites, okay, the Southern Kingdom. And the thing is right here, the Lord is telling basically the Hamites, and also the Arabs. Because remember, the Arabs have allured the Southern Kingdom with Islam, okay, and ultimately they believe that they're praying to the same God, right? They call God Allah, which is simply just means all power. That's all that Allah means, right? And even the Quran states that us Israelites, right, are the children of God. We are the chosen line, right? And they understand this. But again, the thing is ultimately the Lord is basically telling the Hamites and the Ishmaelites that He has nothing to do with them, right? And why is that? Verse 5, because ye have taken my silver and my gold, and have carried into your temples my goodly, pleasant things. The children also of Judah, right, the southern kingdom, the so-called Negroes, and the children of Jerusalem, right, because again, all the mixed multitude, right, the other members from the other tribes that were like remnants in that area, have ye sold unto the Grecians, right? Grecians being the Edomites, right? Because again, by this time, the Grecians were taken over, right? Because again, the original Greeks were the people of the South Sea today, right? The Minoan and the Phrygian, like those people, okay? Those were the original Greeks. Well, they got taken over by the Edomites, okay? When the Edomites were referring to themselves as the Macedonians, right? This is where Alexander the Great comes in, Philip, his father, right? Well, eventually they take over, they become the new Greeks, and this is the Grecians that the Lord is referring to here, right? That basically the Arabs and the true Africans have sold the American Negro to the Caucasians, okay? And ye have removed them far from their border. Behold, I will raise them out of the places whither ye have sold them, and I will return your recompense upon your own head. Right? And this is ultimately the judgments that you're seeing happening over there to the Palestinians, all the Ishmaelites, right? And pretty soon this is ultimately going to culminate in World War III, right? It's also talking about just the, curses and destruction that have, fallen upon Africa, right? And the true Africans that are over there, okay? But, so this is ultimately what's coming to those two groups of people because of the captivity that they put the Southern Kingdom through. Well, let's go ahead and watch this really good documentary that explains a really good synopsis. Like I said again, it's 60 minutes long. It's really good. And now that you have the understanding of who the slave Africans that they talk about in the documentary are, then you understand like the truth of what's going on. It wasn't blacks selling blacks. It was the Hamites selling the children of Israel into slavery, as the Bible refers to it.
World, slavery was a common practice in Arabia centuries before the coming of Islam. Sources tell about slaves being brought to Arabia from the Middle East, India and other countries. But the biggest source of slaves in pre-Islamic Arabia were African slaves from present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Mozambique, Kenya and so on. Old Arabic poetry tells about dark-skinned foreign slaves called Habash. Slavery persisted after Islam became the law of the land in Arabia and expanded with the territorial advance of the Caliphate as well. How did slavery in Arabia transform following the ascent of Islam? What kind of work were the slaves forced to do in the territory of the Caliphate? In this episode, Kings and Generals is going to talk about slavery in the Caliphate. Slavery in Arabia goes back to the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, ignorance period. Arabia had several sources of slave supply, and the largest among them were conflicts. Arabs would raid bordering Byzantine and Persian provinces for the purposes of getting war booty and slaves, and the Ajami, Iraqi slaves, were prominent among them. Intertribal conflict within Arabia would result in the victorious side taking the surviving members of the losing tribe as prisoners, but most of them were ransomed before they could be turned into slaves. But the majority of slaves were imported from Africa. Mecca was a major trading center of the region at the time, and trade caravans, including those which transported African slaves, were going through Mecca. Arab slave owners would purchase them in Mecca. Also, raiding parties would attack caravans and capture slaves for themselves or sell them later. There were two types of slaves, purchased ones and slaves born in the house of their master. Arabia's climate and terrain limited the scope of work in which slaves could be used, but they would work as servants of rich Arabs, as shepherds, and as caravan guides. Female slaves would also be used for sexual purposes. In theory, Islam saw a natural state of a human being as being free, stated as al-asa huwa il-hurriya. Islam brought some limitations and regulations to slavery in Arabia, but slavery was such an ordinary phenomenon for that age, along with being a fundamental element of Arab society, that it was not possible to outright prohibit slavery. All of the Arab elite, including the Prophet, owned slaves. But at the same time, there are numerous Quranic verses and hadiths describing the emancipation of slaves by the Prophet Muhammad, such as Bilal, who became the first muezzin, caller for prayer in the history of Islam, and Zayd, Muhammad's stepson. During his farewell sermon, Muhammad said, "An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action." Historians Neusner and Son argue that prohibiting slavery in the context of 7th century Arabia apparently would have been as useful as prohibiting poverty. It would have reflected a noble ideal, but would have been unworkable on an immediate basis without establishing an entirely new socio-economic system. And its recommendation that slaves be freed is on the same plane as its recommendation that the poor be clothed and the hungry be fed. Thus, slavery was not prohibited in Islam, but the ascension of the Islamic Caliphate led to some reforms in terms of treatment of slaves, their release, and amended procedures related to enslavement. The Quran stated that a slave Muslim is better than a free pagan, that it was better to marry a slave Muslim female than a free pagan. Islam barred Muslims from enslaving other Muslims, called for humane and kind treatment of slaves, and prohibited killing them. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim freed 8,000 of his slaves on his deathbed as manumission was encouraged by Islam. A child born to a freeman father and a slave mother was considered free. This slave woman could not be sold off anymore and would be set free upon the death of the master. The state prohibited freemen from selling their children into slavery as a punishment for debt or a crime. Despite this, the slave population increased due to purchase through military campaigns, commercial purchase, procreation of slaves, and interstate agreements, where the Caliphate insisted on payment of tribute through the import of slaves. People of the book, Jews and Christians, were safe from being enslaved, but Muslims could purchase Jewish and Christian slaves, in case they had become slaves before their purchase, but it was allowed to turn pagans into slaves, even if they would decide to convert to Islam. Moreover, there was a distinction in terms of enslavement between Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war. Dar al-Islam was the territory where Islam was prevalent, and therefore the laws of peacetime applied, while Dar al-Harb was the territory dominated by non-believers who did not recognize Allah and Muhammad as his prophet, therefore a peacetime law did not apply there. This loophole was used to import slaves who were already Muslims, or for the castration of slaves, a practice which was prohibited by Islam. Although good treatment of slaves was encouraged by Islam, slaves were essentially rightless. Their testimonies were not admitted at judicial proceedings. Offense against slaves required half of the punishment envisaged for the same offense against freemen. Slaves were not allowed to enter into a contract, and so on. The death rate of slaves was quite high, particularly among those employed for plantation and mining slavery. On the other hand, the vast majority of slaves lived under better conditions than, for instance, their counterparts in ancient Greece and Rome. Masters were obliged to provide slaves with medical attention, shelter, and support in old age, and were prohibited from overworking them. They could be forced by Islamic courts to emancipate a slave whom they had mistreated. In some cases, slaves had a contractual right to buy their freedom over time, or be emancipated upon the master's death. The expansion of the Caliphate and its military successes were the primary sources of slave supply. people of different races and beliefs, such as Assyrians, Copts, Persians, Nubians, Berbers, Indians, Greeks, Turks, Slavs, etc., were enslaved by the Caliphate. Slaves were acquired from all over the Middle East, Egypt, Iran, the Caucasus, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, India, Spain, Central and Eastern Europe, even China and Southeast Asia. A significant part of the slave supply of Arabia, even before Islam, was from Africa, with countries like Ethiopia and Nubia being the most prominent in this regard. This continued after the ascension of Islam too, and historian Yosef ben Yochanan argues that jihads were brought to Africa as early as the year 640 AD. The expansion of the Caliphate into Egypt and Sub-Saharan Africa, into what the Arabs called Balad ul-Sudan, the land of the blacks, enabled a higher supply of African slaves into the empire. This supply was both from military conquest and booty, along with treaties signed with African states, where they agreed to supply the Caliphate with slaves annually. Moreover, Arabs set up slave trading posts along the southeastern coast of the Indian Ocean, including the archipelago of Zanzibar. This paved the way for the major African slave trade to the Caliphate. Black African slaves were sold in slave markets in Egypt, South Arabia, and the Maghreb. Historian Paul Lovejoy estimates that close to 10 million Africans were shipped out as slaves to Arabia and the Caliphate. According to him, every year 5,000 Africans were brought to Arabia as slaves between the years 650 and 1600. Luis Felipe Jalencastro argues that 8 million African people were sold or sent into slavery through the Oriental and Trans-Saharan slavery routes between the 8th and 19th centuries. Historians might disagree on the numbers, going as high as 30 million, but the truth is that millions of Africans were forced to live and work as slaves in the Caliphate. The slave trade from Africa to Arab countries continued right until the beginning of the 20th century. For instance, slavery in Saudi Arabia was formally abolished as late as 1962, in Oman in 1970. Africa had become a pragmatic choice for slave supply of the Caliphate, as towards the 8th century, most of the borders of the Arab Caliphate had already become more or less stable. There were fewer expansionist wars, which meant there were fewer slaves imported. By then, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Frankish kingdom bordering the Iberian possessions of the Caliphate had become strong enough to oppose further expansion of the Caliphate. Moreover, they were people of the book, and enslavement of Christians was a legally problematic matter. For instance, in the 9th century, the Egyptian Christians rebelled against the Caliphate, and following their defeat, many of them were sold as slaves in Damascus. According to the historian Adam Metz, this was widely criticized in the Caliphate and was considered absolutely illegal. In contrast, Sub-Saharan Africa did not have a political entity strong enough to oppose the Caliphate, and it had maintained and enhanced its position as one of the major sources of slave supply for the Caliphate. Unlike the slaves in the Americas, where they were mostly forced to work in manual labor jobs, such as working on plantations and mining, in the Caliphate, slaves were used in a wider scope of jobs. In the Americas, slaves were a major tool of production, while in the Caliphate they were mostly used in service jobs or for military purposes. Slaves worked as servants, nurses, concubines, entertainers, eunuchs, business assistants, craftsmen, builders, and soldiers. There were also types of slave jobs which existed in the Jahiliyyah period but were prohibited by Islam, such as masters forcing female slaves into prostitution for their personal material gain. Some of the jobs, particularly being a soldier or taking part in administration and business, allowed for upward social mobility for slaves, and Mamluk slaves are the perfect example of the former. In general, slaves working in domestic and urban settings were not subject to overworking and cruelty, and the problem with the Arab historiography of that period is that it's very much focused on urban Arabia, not only with regard to the issue of slavery, but in general. Slaves working in rural settings are largely overlooked, despite being subject to the hardest living conditions among the slaves of Arabia. They were mostly employed in agriculture, mining, and the drainage of marshes. These were mostly black slaves, who were more prone to being overworked, being subject to cruelty, and living in worse conditions, often crammed in dozens in small spaces. It is said that no slave lived for longer than 5 years in the Saharan salt mines. Extremely hard living and working conditions existed in cotton and sugar fields. The slave labor of the black slaves, Zanj as the Arabs called them, in the marshlands and salt flats of southern Iraq are among the most vivid examples of cruelty against slaves in the Caliphate. But white slaves were brought to the Caliphate as well, and were mostly employed in the military, as business associates, and for entertainment of the Arab elite. This demonstrated the existence of racial discrimination in the Caliphate, despite the fact that Islam considered all human beings equal regardless of the color of their skin. Most of the white slaves were Slavic and Turkic. Slavs were considered more expensive than Turks, and were brought into the Caliphate through Germany to Spain. Prague was also one of the centers of the slave trade from Europe to the Caliphate. Meanwhile, Turkic slaves were mostly sold in the slave market of Samarkand. A good-looking white slave woman would cost 1,000 dinars. In some cases, this cost would go as high as 10,000 dinars. In contrast, a good-looking black slave woman would cost 150 to 300 dinars. Black male slaves would cost even less. Their purchase was around 25 to 30 dinars. A special category of slaves in the Caliphate were those specialized in arts and entertainment, who were educated by their masters and then sold to the Arab elite for massive sums. 1 to 2,000 dinars was the average cost of an entertainer. In 937, the de facto ruler of the Caliphate, Ibn Raik, purchased a popular female singer for 14,000 dinars. While Islam alleviated the suffering of slaves and placed certain restrictions on their abuse and encouraged good treatment of slaves, their lives were extremely hard. Slaves working in agriculture, mining and construction had a shorter lifespan and were more susceptible to ill treatment. One of the sites of cruel and inhumane treatment of slaves was the Basra marshlands in southern Iraq, where black slaves were forced to work under horrible conditions. They rebelled against the Caliphate in 869 and would trouble the state for more than 2 decades.